Well, if you've been with us the last few weeks, 7 weeks to be specific, we've been thinking about what it means to be leaky buckets. We've been using that imagery as kind of the overarching theme of this book of 2 Corinthians. It reminds us that Paul uses the language of being jars of clay, but the whole idea being that as long as Christ is in us, we are unbreakable. No matter what the world throws at us, no matter what we might go through, if Christ is within us, we are unbreakable. Now, 2 weeks ago, we talked about hardship. When life is tough, when we get banged up and beat around and knocked over, tipped over like that bucket, the truth is that the love and life of Christ just flows all the more freely around and through us. Last week, we took a look at how God uses heartache. So today, Paul, in this 8th chapter of this book, wants to talk about money. Now, normally, people aren't real excited about a sermon about money, but after 2 weeks of hardship and heartbreak, money might just sound like a pretty nice idea. So we're going to be taking a look at the words he has in chapter 8 of this letter this morning. So let me read, beginning with verse 1, chapter 8. And now, brothers and sisters, we want you to know about the grace that God has given the Macedonian churches. In the midst of a very severe trial, their overflowing joy and their extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. For I testify that they gave as much as they were able, and even beyond their ability. Entirely on their own, they urgently pleaded with us for the privilege of sharing in this service to the Lord's people. And they exceeded our expectations. They gave themselves first to the Lord, and then to us, and then to us also. So we urged Titus, as he had earlier made a beginning, to bring also to completion this act of grace on your part. But since you excel in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in complete earnestness, and in the love we have kindled in you, see to it that you also exceed in this grace of giving. Well, today, as we take a look at this passage, I suspect, again, that the whole issue of money brings up a lot of different feelings. In fact, in my imagination, as I was thinking about the reactions when I preach from time to time about the whole topic of money, generally, in my mind at least, there are 3 different reactions. The first reaction is some of you hear the topic is money, and you basically hold your breath, your heart rate goes up, you squirm a bit in your seat, and then you muttered to yourself, I knew this was the weekend we should have gone up to the mountains. Now, others of you, on the other hand, a little bit more neurotic in nature, I guess, put your head back and your arms out like this and say, go ahead, hit me, beat me, shame me, guilt me. I deserve it all. Still others of you, I suspect, in my mind at least, tighten your fists, look at your watch, cross your arms, and say defiantly, just try to change my mind about all of that. Now, the reason that we have these fairly intense reactions to the topic is I really can't think of a subject that we could talk about in church, or not even in church, that is more of a forbidden kind of a topic to discuss. I've been doing this thing called pastoring for a long time now and talked to a lot of people along the way. We've talked about a lot of topics in my office, but the truth is I have more often had topics and discussions about what happens in people's bedrooms than what happens with their bank account. It's the great forbidden topic, it seems. And I think the reason is that we have so many mixed up feelings about this whole topic of money. If we knew exactly how we felt about it, we could be more open and direct about talking about it. But our feelings are so ambivalent. We're afraid we don't have enough of it. We're afraid we have too much of it. We have a desire to have more, and we feel guilty that we might just want more. We like being affluent. We're afraid we might just like it too much. Because we have all these ambivalent feelings about it, we just try to not talk about it. But the Bible really won't let us keep avoiding it. Of all the topics that Jesus spoke about, this topic, money, was the number one topic after talking about the kingdom of God. And that's why Paul gets into it in this 8th chapter, after all the other things he's been going through in the book. So the first issue when it comes to money is an issue of trust. So I want to invite you to join me in an experiment on trust today. Now, I'm not sure you're going to do this, or some of you won't, but I'm going to just see if we can get at least some of you to do this. So here's the experiment on trust. I want you to take out of your pocket or your purse your wallet or your checkbook, or if you use Apple Pay, your phone. Just take it out of your wallet or your purse or your pocket just for a minute. Just take it out. Hold it out there in front of you for a moment. Now, you can caress it if you want to. That's all right, you know. What you're holding, for many people, is the temple of the 21st century. Now, this is the place people look to as a god. This is the place they look to for their security, for their identity, for their value, for all the things that they say count. They look to this to give them the things that God wants to give us. Okay, now here's the exercise in trust. Take that wallet, purse, or checkbook, or your phone. Here's what I want you to do. Pass it to the person next to you. Pass it to the person next to you. Go ahead, right now. Do it. Now check your pulse. Is it still there? Is it racing? Okay, deacons, we're going to have a special offering now. And I want you to give like you have never given in your life. No, we're not going to do that. Put that wallet back in a safe place. I don't want us finding that stuff later on and wondering where it went. If you have been with us, though, you know that Paul's been writing this letter to a church that's in a very market-driven kind of materialistic hub of that part of Greece. He's writing to people who live with this mindset, or the culture around them does at least, that wallet is the thing to be worshipped, to be looked to for value and identity. And he wants to talk to them about another way to look at what we have. He wants to give them an example of what gracious, generous living looks like. And he does that in this chapter. And let me invite you to take a look at some of the verses we're going to begin with. And the first verse in chapter 8 goes like this. And now, he says, brothers and sisters, we want you to know about the grace that God has given the Macedonian churches. In the midst of a very severe trial, their overflowing joy and their extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. Paul says that these rural Macedonian churches to the north were characterized, he says, by two traits. Two remarkable traits, in fact. The first trait was this high level of joy. He calls it overflowing joy. The second trait, he says, that characterizes these churches in Macedonia was this extreme level of poverty. Now, do those two traits seem to be unusual to see together? Overwhelming joy, extreme poverty. And what Paul says is that that's what characterized the churches in Macedonia, and the result of those two traits was that those churches were experiencing this rich generosity. In fact, honestly, you could probably turn this into almost a mathematical equation Paul is offering, that overflowing joy plus extreme poverty equals a wealth of generosity. And the example of that would probably remind us of one of those kind of mathematical deals that, if it's true this way, the reverse ends up being true as well. And I suspect that's right as well. That if it's true that overflowing joy plus extreme poverty equals a wealth of generosity, the opposite is also true. That discontent or lack of joy plus extreme affluency equals a trickle of generosity. The discontent plus extreme affluence equals a mere trickle of generosity. I think what Paul is trying to say is just this: that people don't live generous lives when they have more money. People practice generosity when they have more joy. Because when they have more joy, they are no longer dependent on the contents of that leather temple in their pocket for their next happiness fix. And so the first point, if you're filling in the blanks this morning, is just this: the generosity springs from having more joy, not having more money. And I think that that's borne out in all kinds of ways. I was talking to somebody last night who had just come back from a mission trip in Haiti, a place of just extraordinary, abject poverty. And yet she said the joy she saw in the faces of those people was something she had never witnessed in her life in any group that she'd ever met. And I think if you ask some of the young people who have been on mission trips, or if you've been on some kind of a mission trip to a developing nation, you will see a kind of joy and a kind of generosity that just is almost unknown to us here in affluent North America. 60 years ago, it was, the University of Michigan did a survey of how happy Americans were. This was back in 1956, and they found out that 34% of Americans described themselves as very happy. 34% of the people they polled, a nationwide poll, described themselves 60 years ago as very happy. Now, corrected for inflation, real disposable income for middle-class Americans today in America has gone up at least 50%. But when they surveyed folks just a few years back and asked them how happy they were, 34% described themselves as very happy. See, the two equations and factors don't correlate. Joy doesn't come from simply having more of what we have, more stuff, and that we think would be happier if we had it. Paul says, I want you to understand there's a kind of grace that's been at work among these rural, poor Macedonian churches. And there's this strange kind of mathematics of giving that I want you to grasp as well. That joy plus poverty led to generosity. And so generosity springs from having more joy, not having more money. That's the first thing Paul says here. Second thing, verse 3 says, for I testify that they gave as much as they were able, and even beyond their ability, entirely on their own. Now, the question you got to ask is, how do you give beyond your own ability? I mean, how can you give more than you're able? Well, clearly what Paul is alluding to is that God has enlarged their capacity to give. And Paul talks about that more in the next chapter, in chapter 9, verses 11 and 12. He talks about how people are in Macedonia giving beyond their capacity. And he reminds them of that in verses 11. Listen, you will be enriched in every way so that you can be generous on every occasion. And through us, your generosity will result in thanksgiving to God. This service that you perform is not only supplying the needs of the Lord's people, but also overflowing in many expressions of thanks to God. See, what Paul is saying is that when we give, a kind of divine supernatural process begins that enriches not only the person that's receiving the gift, but also enriches the giver. He wants us to understand that there's this process that begins when we become generous with what we are and what we have, that enriches not only those of us that give, but also the person that receives as well. And that when people's hearts are captivated by a desire to give, God enables them to give in ways that they never dreamt that they could give. I know people who have begun this adventure in giving. And every day, every week is a new way for them to think about how can they be generous with who they are, their time, their gifts, their talents. And it just wells up a sense of generosity and a sense of joy along with that. And so here's the second blank. When you give, it not only enriches the receiver, it enriches you. That's what Paul wants us to understand. Verse 4, they urgently pleaded with us for the privilege of sharing in this service to the Lord's people, for they exceeded our expectations. They gave themselves, first of all, to the Lord, and then by the will of God also to us. Now again, Paul's speaking about these rural, poor churches in the north in Macedonia. In verse 2, he described them as having extreme poverty. And then he says, despite their poverty, they urgently pleaded with us, the church did in Macedonia, for the privilege of sharing in this service to the Lord's people. The Macedonian churches, these poor folks, urgently pleaded with Paul, asking him to take their gift to the church in Jerusalem that was so desperately in need. Now, when you think of fundraising, generally the person that's doing the urgent pleading isn't the person who's being asked to give. Generally, it's the fundraiser, isn't it? I mean, it's the whole other way around. And it's almost like Paul is saying, you know, I know your poverty up here in Macedonia. I know you don't have much here at all. And I know you really don't and probably ought not to be kind of giving very much right now. But they say, no, please, we want to do this. This is important for us. We want to give. That's not usually how fundraising goes. Over the years, churches, other nonprofits have come up with all sorts of different wacky ways to raise funds. I suspect that some of you have been in churches where it seemed like that's all they ever talked about. Heard about a church in the Twin Cities. This is a true story. They were having a financial shortfall, and so they started brainstorming how they could encourage people to give. And so what they decided to do was that at the end of the offering, when people put all their offering envelopes in the plate, at the end of that, the deacons came up, and one of the deacons took one envelope out of the plate, and whatever that offering was, that person received that day twice as much as was in the envelope. Kind of a lottery deal. You know, put in 100, you get 200 back. Put in 1,000, get 2,000 back. That kind of a thing. Now remember, this is in the Twin Cities. I mean, these are Swedes and Norwegians. You know, they're not known to be the most kind of extravagant kind of folks. They're kind of restrained in all this. This isn't Las Vegas. Paul says, I'm not going to pressure people here to give. They're the ones that are asking. They're urgently wanting to give. In fact, he issues, because of this urgency, a challenge to the church now in Corinth. He says to them, but since you excel in everything, in speech, or in faith and speech and knowledge, in complete earnestness, and in the love we have kindled in you, see that you also excel in this grace of giving. And so he says to the church in Corinth, this challenge, sets forth this challenge that they model the kind of generosity that they have seen in these folks who are up north. Now, if you've paid close attention to this whole kind of chapter, one of the things you'll discover is that there's a small word that Paul keeps using over and over and over again. It's that little word called grace. In verse 1, he talks about the grace of God in Macedonia. In verse 4, he says the people there beg for the grace of sharing in the ministry of giving. In verse 6, he talks about completing this act of grace. In verse 7 here, he says, may you excel in the grace of giving. And so Paul wants to make this intimate connection between grace and giving. That authentic, generous, freely offered gifts are an unmistakable sign of God's grace at work. Now, often when we think about grace, we talk about grace at church, we often restrict it. We think about it as God's readiness to forgive us of our sins. Amazing grace is the kind of thing we talk about when we want to remember that Jesus forgives us. But the grace of God is much more than Jesus and God in general's willingness to forgive sins. I mean, God was gracious long before the fall, long before there were any sins that needed to be forgiven. The word that lies at the heart of grace, the graciousness of God, is the word give. To say that God is a gracious God is to say that God is this irrepressible giver. And so Paul wants to say, I want that same kind of grace that characterizes God to characterize God's people. And so there's the third blank. When we practice generosity, we are following the heart of a gracious God. Now, when Paul addresses this whole topic of giving, he takes great pains to make sure that his discussion of it is itself an expression and discussion of graciousness. He says, for example, each of you must give as you have made up your mind to give. It's got to be up to you. Each of you must not give under compulsion. In fact, look at verse 8. I am not commanding you, but I want to test the sincerity of your love by comparing it with the earnestness of others. And in verse 3, when he's talking about the Macedonians, he says, for as I can testify, they gave as much as they were able, how? Entirely on their own. And he stresses that. They did not do this out of some kind of pressure or some compulsion. This was an act they freely chose. Verse 10, he says, and here is my judgment about what is best for you in this matter. That's a nuanced way of saying, I'm not giving you an order of how much you ought to give. I'm just giving you some thoughtful advice on how to think about the issue of giving. And so he wants them to understand that to give is a gift. And the choice of how and what you give is yours alone. But he wants them to excel in giving. In fact, that's the fourth blank if you're filling them in. To excel in giving is to take the next step in practicing generosity. And so that's his challenge to the Corinthian church, and it's our challenge that I'll lay out for you today. The challenge is simply to take the next step in this act of giving, this grace of giving. I don't know what the next step is for you. I mean, there's lots of us at lots of different places in the whole issue of giving. For some of you, the whole idea of giving to the church is something you really haven't thought a whole lot about. You're new, or you've really never realized that, hey, maybe that's an area of my life I ought to take more seriously. And so for you, if you've never given before, the next step is to just start giving a bit to the church and to other worthwhile ministries that God is working in. For others of you, you give now and again, kind of inconsistently or periodically or whatever. And the next step for you might be to just make that practice of giving a more consistent kind of a way. One of the things that many of us do is just do this giving kind of automatically through automatic withdrawals, and you can set that up on the church website or figure out another way to do it with your banking. In the Old Testament, the folks were invited, really called to give proportionately, and that's another thing for some of us that ought to be thought through. That we don't just give now and again, but that we give representing what we actually have. That we give proportionately is the word I guess I'll use. Still others of us, perhaps, grew up in church maybe, and you knew you had to give. I mean, somebody's got to give. And so you've done it, but you've done it grudgingly or in a kind of a way out of duty. And the next step for you is to realize there's joy when you give towards something that changes people's lives. And so that may be the next step for you. But see, whatever the next step is, that's what Paul invites us to do when he says to excel in this whole area of giving. And it's possible when we do that to express the heart of God through that. And then he comes to really one of the most beautiful verses in the entire Bible. And it's a verse in verse 9 that is really just so rich you could spend months kind of thinking about it. Verse 9, for you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that through his poverty you might become rich. Paul says that the grace of God is demonstrated when Christ, who had the riches of heaven, honor and glory beyond imagination, and he gave all of that up, was born in a barn, eked out an existence in an obscure village, part of an obscure family, becomes an itinerant preacher. He said, foxes have holes, birds of the air have nests, I don't have a place to lay my head. Paul says he was poor, not because poverty is a good thing, by the way. He was poor so that you could become rich. And in this upside-down kingdom, the hero starts out rich and ends up poor. Now, usually it's the other way around, isn't it? All the great stories. The hero's the poor boy who becomes rich. In the kingdom, though, the one who is already beyond wealth and his riches gives it all up to become poor. And so that's the challenge of Paul's words today, to consider what it means for each of us to take the next step in our willingness to live generous lives. So if I might, I'll just invite you to consider some homework for the next week sometime. Here's what I'd like to invite you to do. I'd invite you to just take that wallet back out at some point in the week. Let's take it out. Put it on your laptop or on your desk at work or maybe at home. And just take 5 minutes. Just take 5 minutes and talk to God about that wallet, that checkbook. And you might want to just say, so God, how important all of this has always been to me. Maybe too important to me. And I want to start looking at it a little differently. I want to I want you to help me see that all I have finally belongs to you. I mean, it all belongs to you. The whole rule of ownership is this. If you make it, you own it. If you make it, you own it. I didn't make this. I don't make my time. I don't make anything I have. It's all given to me. So God, what do you want me to do with my life, with my resources, with my time, my talents? How can I live my life as someone that expresses generosity? How can I excel in that so that I can be a person that you can use in all kinds of different ways? When you just do that, see what you sense as you kind of go through your week. One of the things that God reminds us of is that he is the giver of all good gifts, and he has shown that by giving us the ultimate gifts. He has given up heaven to come to earth to join us in our humanity. And we see that realized and are reminded of it each month when we take time to celebrate the Lord's Supper. See, we're going to finish up our service today by doing that. We're going to be celebrating the Lord's Supper, and so as we take the elements and distribute them, one of the things we want you to think about is you didn't really make this meal. God gave it to you. And it's a gift he gives you. And he just asks you to receive it with gratitude. And in the same way, all that we have comes from him. And when we receive it with gratitude. It's of me. And after supper, he took a cup and said, "This cup is a new promise I make to you all. Drink it as often as you do in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat the bread, drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." We'll distribute the elements as you stay in your seats. We invite you just to take some time and to be mindful of this gift of grace that God gives you and his invitation that we, in turn, live gracious, generous lives as well.